Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. This is a podcast where we seek to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our chaotic world. I'm your host, Aaron Shamp, and I'm just excited that you join us for another episode here at Filter. And so what we're doing this episode is we're doing something looking at something that's more of a church issue. And we're doing this because aside from me being a podcast host, I am also a pastor of a local church. That's actually my full-time role. And this podcast is really an extension of that ministry. And so one thing that we are doing at the local church that I pastor right now is we are going through a process in installing our very first elder board. Ever since we got started back in 2014, we started with me alone being the only elder, but now we're reaching a point in our growth and maturity where we are ready to add on some other people who are going to be joining in with me and leading the church in the role of church elder. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to do a couple of podcast episodes for you guys who are listeners to the podcast, as well as to help the members of our church understand what church elders are, what it's all about, and so on. And so that's what we're doing here. We're going to do this in a couple of parts and look at what the Bible has to say about elders, who they are, what they do, and so on. And so whoever you are, whether you are a member of Redeemer or not, I hope that this is really helpful for you. And so we're going to start right off with looking at what are church elders. And so we're going to do a definition first, a basic definition, and then look at some scriptures that explain elders to us, and then also talk about the biblical qualifications for church elders. And so just starting off with a definition of what church elders are. So first off, it's important that we understand that church elders are referring to an office and not a generation. By that I mean like a demographic in a local congregation which is like the older demographic, the elder people. Whenever we talk about elders in the church, or whenever we see elders being talked about in the New Testament, it's not referring to just the older people in terms of age in the church, but it's referring to an office. It's using some Greek words which are always used in terms of this leadership role in the church. And we can be getting into those here in a little bit. But, just an example of that is that Timothy, whenever Paul was writing to him in 1st and 2nd Timothy, was one of the elders of the church in Ephesus. But we also know from reading those letters that Timothy was one of the younger people in that congregation, because Paul encouraged him. He said, "Don't let anyone look down on you because of your youth." And yet he is was one of the leaders of that church. And so elders is not something that is referring, once again, to a demographic or generation in the church, but it's referring to what is an office of the church. So let me give you my simple definition, which is that an elder is a shepherding role in the church. And so by this, that means that shepherds are responsible for teaching, for praying for the members, for caring for the members, for protecting the teaching and protecting the members, and then leading the flock in the various leadership responsibilities that there are. We're going to be getting more into the roles and what elders do in the next part, and that'll help give some insights to this definition. But for now, that's a good simple definition for us, which is really that elders are shepherds in the church. There's a guy named Jeremy Wren who wrote a really good book called Church Elders. This book right here, good book. He wrote a book called Church Elders, and in that book, he explains that being an elder is not like a few things that we often think of when we often think of what elders do in a church. So a church elder is not, it's not like being a minister at a school, where all they're there for is doing administrative tasks and so on. Not what a church elder does. A church elder is not also like running a company. So it's not like the CEO, the CFO, and so on that you have in a business. Being a church elder is also not like just serving on a board of trustees that provides some kind of oversight to the operations of an organization, or some accountability to some of those top leaders, such as the CEO, CFO, and so on. Being a church elder involves some aspects of these things, like being a school administrator, because church elders are they have somewhat of an administrative role in their leadership. They also serve somewhat of a role like a CEO would in casting vision for the church. And they also provide accountability to the various ministries and to the leaders in that church. But this is not primarily what elders are for, and especially whenever the New Testament talks about elders. This is not primarily what they are for. Instead, Jeremy Wren said this in his book. He said, Jesus gave apostles, this would be his 12 disciples, the apostles. Jesus gave apostles and then elders to tend his flock as under shepherds until he returns. Ephesians 4, 7 through 13, and 1 Peter 5, 1 through 4. Elders are Jesus' assistants for shepherding his churches, end quote. And so once again, an elder is primarily a shepherd, and that shepherd is responsible for teaching, praying, caring, protecting, and leading the flock. Here's another good definition from a guy who wrote a book called Biblical Eldership, Alexander Strauch. It's probably Strauch. He says this. He said, according to the New Testament concept of eldership, elders lead the church, teach and preach the word, protect the church from false teachers, exhort and admonish the saints in sound doctrine, visit the sick and pray, and judge doctrinal issues. In biblical terminology, elders shepherd, oversee, lead, and care for the local church. So let's look at where we see elders in Scripture and what the Bible has to say about this office of the church. So first of all, the New Testament uses the terms elder, overseer, and even shepherd or pastor interchangeably. I'm going to give you several examples of that here in a minute. But like I said before, whenever I said how whenever the New Testament talks about elders, it's talking about that office and not just the older people. One of the reasons we know that is because of the Greek. In the Greek, whenever Paul or Peter or whoever else is talking about the elders of the church, they're using either the word presbyteros in the Greek, which is the word for elder, or episkopos, which is the word for overseer, whenever they're referring to this role. And so not just your typical words for someone who is older in age. And so the New Testament uses these terms, elder, overseer, pastor, shepherd, interchangeably in the New Testament. Consider a few examples. So first, this one is from Acts chapter 20, verses 17 and the verse 28. In verse 17, it says, now from Miletus, he, who is Paul, sent to Ephesus and summoned the elders of the church. And then later on in verse 28, whenever he's talking to the elders, he says, be on guard for yourselves and for all of the flock of which the Holy Spirit has appointed you as overseers to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. So once again, there we see that interchangeability of these terms. And we especially once again see also that these are not just a board of trustees, but that they are shepherds who are overseeing the flock that Jesus purchased with his blood. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, Peter said, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and witness to the sufferings of Christ, as well as one who shares in the glory about to be revealed. Shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing out of compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not out of greed for money, but eagerly, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. So right there in that passage, you can see a lot of what I've already brought up, the interchangeability of the words elder, shepherd, overseer, the primary role of elders being shepherds to the church, and also like that quote from Jeremy Wren, which said that elders are like under shepherds or assistant shepherds to Jesus, because here Peter refers to Jesus as the chief shepherd. Let's consider a few more things that the New Testament has to say about elders. So this is our second point, which is that the New Testament always refers to a plurality of elders leading a local congregation. And so this gets to what I was talking about earlier with the relevance of this episode to what we're doing in my church and in our church leadership right now, which is that in the initial beginning of the church and its founding, planting, and then growing it, I was advised that it would be most wise for me to be the single elder just for a period of time in our churches, in the beginning of our church's life, just to keep things simple and especially to protect the integrity of the church's leadership whenever the church is young and very unstable, vulnerable during that time. So if you have one elder that protects from, having a board of elders that could become easily divided in the younger days of a church. And so here's where our church, Redeemer, is trying to move from being a single elder-led church to a plurality elder-led church. And here are some scriptures, just a sampling, just a few. Some scriptures that point to the New Testament model, which is that you always have a team or a plurality of elders. So let's consider some of these. So in Acts chapter 14, verse 23, this is referring to Paul and Barnabas whenever they were on one of their missionary journeys. And it says, when they had appointed elders, once again, plural, they appointed elders for them in every church and prayed with fasting. They committed them to the Lord. So this is after Paul and Barnabas had been planting several churches in a region called Lystra and Derbe. After they had planted multiple local congregations in all these various areas, it says that they appointed elders, plural, in each church. So not just one elder here, one over there, but elders in each local congregation. Here's another one from Acts in chapter 16, verse 4. It says, as they traveled through the towns, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem for the people to observe. And so what this is referring to is right after this event that we call the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. You can go and read about that, where the leaders of the church in Jerusalem got together and asked themselves, what does it mean for Gentiles to become Christians, a part of the church? Because up until this point, the church had only been Jewish. And so they never really had to ask that question. What does a Christian who is not a Jew look like? So they talk about that together. And Paul is, as the primary missionary to the Gentiles, is going back around, visiting all the churches that he had planted and sharing the news with them. And it's interesting what it says about that Jerusalem council, that the decision was reached by the apostles. So once again, these were Jesus's 11 disciples, because the 12th, Judas, right, was no longer alive at this point. This was his 11 apostles, the 12th to replace Judas, and then Paul himself. So it says the apostles and elders. And so even beneath the apostles in the church in Jerusalem at this time, they had a plurality of elders leading that church. Okay, let's move on to some others. There's more in Acts, but we're going to look at some others. In 1 Timothy 4, verses 14, it says, don't neglect the gift that is in you. It was given to you through prophecy with a laying on of hands by the council of elders. So once again, we see plurality there. In Titus 1:5, Paul wrote to Titus, the reason I left you in Crete was to set right what was left undone, and as I directed you, to appoint elders, plural, in every town. So it's interesting here how Paul, in his mind, church planning is not done, and building a church is not complete unless there is a plurality of elders leading every local congregation. Lastly, James 5:14. James wrote, if anyone sick among you, he should call for the elders of the church, and they are to pray over him. So, a few examples, or several examples of the plurality of elders that we see in the New Testament, and these are just a few examples. There's a lot more. And so, let's talk about the qualifications for elders now. The primary place that we find the biblical qualifications for elders is in 1 Timothy chapters 2 and 3, and then in Titus 1. Now, we see a couple of things, and so we're going to take these one by one when it comes to the biblical qualifications for elders. We're going to look at this a little deep. So first of all, we believe that the New Testament teaches that the role of church elder is reserved for male leadership. This is the position of my church, this is the position of Redeemer, and we believe this based on a few different points. I can't go into too much depth here just for the sake of time, but I will give you a place to go if you want to research this topic a little bit deeper. But as for our church, as for the church that I lead, we believe that it's the biblical position that church elders are reserved for male leadership. So just a few reasons why. First of all, whenever you read the Bible, once again, all of Jesus's apostles were men. He chose 12 men to be his 12 disciples, to be his apostles, to be the main leaders of the church. Now, we know from reading the Gospels that among the broader group of his disciples, there were many women, right? It was men and women. But as for the leaders of his new church that would be started after his ministry, death, and resurrection, these were all men. Also in Acts chapter 1, whenever the apostles get together to decide how and who are they going to choose to replace Judas, who, if you know the story, turned out to be a traitor, committed suicide. Whenever they chose, they didn't choose from among any options of men and women, but they only chose from men and then chose a man to replace Judas. So that's one point. Secondly, all the elders who are mentioned in Acts or anywhere else in the New Testament as leaders in churches were men as well. Now, female leaders are mentioned in Acts, and they're mentioned in some of Paul's shout-outs in some of his letters later on in the New Testament. But once again, whenever we see any reference to the elders of a church, that specific office who were leading the church in the word and in prayer, these were always men. Lastly, and I think what is the most clear example is in 1 Timothy 2. In 1 Timothy 2, 12 and 13, Paul writes this. He says, "I do not allow a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. Instead, she is to remain quiet." And why? What does he base this off of? Off of this, he says, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve." So this is more than, because often people will object to our position with saying that Paul's reasoning for choosing only male leadership in church eldership, because he allowed women to lead in other ways, was based upon culture. It was really just sociological reasons and not biblical reasons. And the only reason that he didn't challenge those sociological factors was because he wanted to maintain an effective ministry in their culture. But I think that this verse contradicts that suggestion, because Paul makes no kind of qualification for, I think, women. I sometimes allow women, based on the context or so on, but instead he bases this in the creation itself, in the fact that, as he says, Adam was formed first, then Eve. Okay, like I said, I don't have a lot of time to go into a full in-depth argument for this position or defense of this position. I'd encourage you, if you're really interested in digging deeper into this specific point of church elders, to go and see Alexander Strout's book, Biblical Eldership. This book right here, one of the most authoritative books on biblical eldership. He has a chapter called Male Leadership. So that's pages 51 through 66. You can go and read a much fuller defense than what I was able to give now. And so just real quickly. So we believe that biblical elders are reserved for male leadership. The second point on the qualifications from the Bible is that the character qualifications for church elders are found in two places: 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7, and Titus 1, 5 through 9. I'm going to read to you the 1 Timothy passage. In 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7, Paul wrote, "This saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to be an overseer," once again, elder, "he desires a noble work. An overseer, therefore, must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, self-controlled, sensible, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not an excessive drinker, not a bully, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not greedy. He must manage his own household competently and have his children under control with all dignity. If anyone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of God's church? He must not be a new convert, or he might become conceited and incur the same condemnation as the devil. Furthermore, he must have a good reputation among outsiders, so that he does not fall into disgrace in the devil's trap." Let's consider here the various qualifications that we see just in this one passage, not even getting to Titus yet. There are a lot. Paul says, first of all, that church elders must be above reproach. This means that they live a lifestyle which has such an exemplary character that they cannot even be blamed. Right? They are their conduct is so good that that you really can't even throw accusations against them. Right? So this is above reproach. That's the first one we see. The second one is the husband of one wife. So this means that there's some debate over some of the fine points of the Greek here, but we can just keep it simple and say, obviously, he is talking about a man being faithful to his wife. That's what he's talking about. Third, self-controlled. elders need to be men who are self-controlled. Then sensible. We also see respectable. So self-controlled, sensible, respectable. That is pretty closely connected to the above reproach point there. This is a unique one. This is an able teacher. Okay, so just to point that out, an able teacher, one that's a little bit different. Maybe kind of mark that one in your mind. Another good one, an excessive drinker. So someone who is not given over to drunkenness and lacks self-control there, right? So self-controlled, not excessive drinker. Those are certainly connected. Gentle. So, I think it also says either in that passage we just read or in the Titus passage, it says not a bully, but gentle, right? So that's an important attribute for a church elder to have if they're going to be someone who is correcting people and calling people to repent of sin. You need to be able to be gentle with God's flock whenever you do that. Not quarrelsome. So people who just like to argue don't make good church elders. Not greedy. Once again, church elders exercise a lot of leadership and authority, sometimes have access to finances and things that other people don't have. So you want to make sure you don't have somebody who is greedy, who might be tempted to mishandle resources. Manages his household competently. As Paul said, if he can't demonstrate leadership and competence in his own household, how can we expect him to in the church? Not a new convert. Also another unique one, maybe one to kind of put in your mind and remember. We're going to come back to later. And then lastly, in the Timothy list, a good reputation among outsiders. So similar to above reproach, but more focused outwardly. We're not going to read the Titus passage. I'm just going to give you another list of what Titus says. In these two passages, they're almost perfect parallels. So what we saw in 1 Timothy 3, Titus either also has, or he has in slightly different words, or a couple of different ones, or Paul writing to Titus. And so in the Titus passage, we see Paul also adds not arrogant. So that's one that we didn't exactly see, right, in the first passage, but not arrogant. So we could say humility. Not hot-tempered, it says in the Titus passage. So this would be one that goes back to that gentleness aspect, to the not quarrelsome aspect that we saw in 1 Timothy, but not hot-tempered, right? Hospitable. So that's the that's the opposite of being greedy. So in 1 Timothy we see not greedy. That's a lover of money. So in other words, what the two passages together are telling us is that church elders should not be lovers of money, but lovers of people. Right? Loving what is good is one of the ones in Titus. In Titus, we also see that church elders should be righteous, that they should be holy in their conduct. So really similar to some of the other things we've seen as well. Holding to the faithful message. So that kind of expounds for us, and that explains to us what an able teacher means, right? So not just a good communicator, but a communicator who holds on to the faithful message as it is taught in Scripture. And then the last one is that able to encourage with sound teaching. So once again, teaching in there again, and also refute those who contradict it. So as we go and close, let me give you just a couple of notes, a couple of reflections on these lists. The first one is this. With the exception of those two I told you to keep in mind, with the exception of able to teach and not a new convert, this list describes the character which should really characterize all believers. Did any of you guys notice that when we were going through this, that everything that was listed, other than those two, are things that really should be true of us all? If you're married, right? If you're a man, you should be the husband to one wife. You should be faithful, and vice versa. If you're a wife, you should be the wife of one husband. And we should all be gentle and not hot-tempered, not bully, not quarrelsome. We should all pursue righteousness and holiness. We should. No Christian should be an excessive drinker. Should be self-controlled, and so on. And so it describes the character that really all of us should have, with the exception of those 2 points of not being a new convert. Because eventually you move on from being not new, and then also able to teach. And so just consider something that this means, and I think Mark Dever explains this really well. I like what he has to say. He says, why would this be the case? He says, because an elder should model a life that is exemplary for other Christians. You wouldn't want an elder's pattern of life to be something that is unreachable, but something that can be followed. And I just think that's that's one of the best reflections I've ever seen on the nature of these lists, and how there's nothing really extraordinary about the character qualifications. And I think what Dever says is right on, is that we want them, church elders, to have a list with, a character and the virtues that list describes, and in that to be something that the people in our churches, and that you in your church, something that you can actually live up to, and something that you can follow, and something that doesn't just appear to be unreachable to you. Another note on these lists, which is that if you notice, these lists didn't have anything to say about Bible reading habits, or prayer habits, or leadership skills, or a lot of the other things that a church should really want in an elder, right? And so what we can point out about these lists is that they are certainly not exhaustive. We can add some extra qualifications based off of the roles that the Bible talks about elders need to have, what elders do in our churches. We can add some extra qualifications, some extra competencies that we want to see in our church leaders, adding on to that list. So we certainly cannot take away from that list, but we should also reflect that that it's pretty common sense that these lists are not exhaustive. And then the last note is that we should not just assume that because a man is a proven leader in the world, in business or wherever else, that means that he should be a church elder. Here's another quote from Dever. Once again, he says, churches should search for men of character, reputation, ability to handle the word, and fruitfulness. These qualities should mark the leaders of our church. They live not for themselves, but for others. And so, like he said, character, reputation, ability to handle the word, these are the things which we should put first and foremost in what we look for in church elders. And so here's my bibliography and further resources. If you want to learn some more about church elders, well, then stick around, because like I said, this is going to be a multi-part series, and I'm going to do a little bit more in the near future about what church elders are and what they do and so on. But if you want some extra resources, then I would highly recommend to you this book by Alexander Strock, Biblical Eldership. Like I said, one of the most authoritative books that's out there on this topic. If you want something a little bit smaller and easier, quicker to read, I recommend this little book by Mark Dever called Understanding Church Leadership. Really, really good book that covers elders, deacons, church membership, and a lot of other issues. And so I hope you enjoyed your time with us. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Filter. I hope you come back and join us for another one. If you enjoyed this episode, would you like it? Would you subscribe to our podcast? And especially, would you share it with a friend? And so I just want to thank you guys so much for joining us for this episode. See you again soon.